Okay, guys, so this is chapter 1 of AICE International History. We're back at it again, 1.1 and 1.4 this time. So we're going to start with 1.1, so buckle up and get ready to learn. Okay, guys, welcome to 1.1. We're starting off with 1.1a, which are the economic and political motives for imperialism. Now, imperialism is the policy of extending a nation's power by gaining political and economic control over more territory, so expanding your territory. This is sometimes called colonialism, as territories under control are known as colonies. So if you hear colonialism, imperialism, they're the same thing. And this imperialism was largely driven by the ideology of mercantilism, which is an economic policy based on the belief that there was only a limited amount of wealth in the world. And basically think of this as if there's only $100 in the world, every nation wanted to get the most out of those $100, and that's what they thought happened. They didn't think that you could create more wealth. They thought that you had just a certain amount of wealth splattered onto the earth and it wasn't going to grow. It was just going to stay there, and they needed to get the most of it. And a lot of people who led these ideology were entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs were people who invest their money in business ventures, and they take this risk of investing their money hoping to make a lot of profit. So basically what ended up happening was that these entrepreneurs they arose during this time due to industrialization. Industrialization is basically the process where you take a material or like a product and you make it faster. So it's like compared to like in a pre-industrial society, I would have to like grab this napkin holder and weld it and everything. But in an industrial society, which is most societies nowadays, you just have machines that just poke these holes in here and just. So if I was welding it and cutting out the pieces so intricately, I would make like 10 a day. But with this machine, pop, 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 just poking holes in it, it came out super fast, and it was like 1,000 a day. And this led for there to be a like demand stagnation. So demand for the napkin holders was here, but we were making this much. You see the difference? So then basically these companies were losing money, and then they unemployed people. So then demand went down again, lost more money. Then that was the long depression, and that is deflation. So deflation is basically when you have very like little demand, a lot of supply, and then you cause unemployment, causes poverty, and then that leads to more deflation. So it's like a toxic vicious cycle. This led to the Europeans needing more markets to sell to stop this deflation. And a lot of these markets were monopolized. And a monopoly is basically a market structure that is characterized by a single seller facing no competition. So it's like if I'm the only person making this napkin holder, that's a monopoly. Like if I'm the only person in Europe making my napkin holders, that's a monopoly because I don't have any competition. Now, monopolies in the U.S. are illegal, but during this time, first of all, it's out of the U.S., and during this time, we didn't really have that many laws restricting markets because this was just such a new concept to the people, so they didn't really know what to do. And these entrepreneurs wanted to invest in things, so they wanted to invest their money into things that they felt like were sustainable, and they thought that investing in new markets and raw materials, which is what you need to make a product, would be sustainable. So these were the four economic reasons for why European countries imperialized. They needed raw materials to make products, needed markets to sell their products to, and the entrepreneurs wanted to invest, opportunities to invest, and also the need to decrease deflation. Now, we also had political factors that were involved, and the first one was like a kind of like how can I say this? Europe became more stable after 1871, and basically this led to they couldn't get more territory in Europe. Like they just couldn't. Europe became stable, they settled borders, so they couldn't get more territory in Europe, so they wanted to expand outwards. Also, people in Europe were obsessed with getting to Asia. And in the 1800s, they created this canal called the Suez Canal that cut the time, because Africa is like this, right? Before you had to go all the way around Africa. Now you could just cut through Egypt, and that was so much more convenient for every country. So they needed to control those choke points in order to exert their power over other countries and be able to like charge them tariffs and taxes for passing through their territory. This is what Britain did. Britain controlled the Cape at the bottom and the Suez Canal at the top. So they basically controlled the two choke points between Asia and Europe. Also, there was a lot of nationalism going on during the time. So nationalism is a sense of belonging to a nation and supporting its interests above those of other nations. It's basically the belief that your country is superior in ethnic ways, cultural ways, political ways, and historic ways compared to every single other country. So it's not like if I say, oh yeah, Venezuela has better history and culture and policies than America. That's not me being a nationalist. That's just me comparing the two countries. But if I'm like, oh yeah, Venezuela is the best country in the world. Like no other country like can even get to Venezuela's level. Like we have the best ethnic people. Like we have the best ethnicities. We have the best culture, best politics. That's me being a nationalist, and that basically led to a lot of people feeling a lot of like insane pride for their country, and that led them to like do certain things, like push their countries to go out. Also, many countries wanted to please their people at home and give them what they wanted of like expansion and like being amazing. So they took imperialism to do that, and that's basically why the countries were going out. So economically, they wanted raw materials, they wanted to decrease deflation, they wanted new markets to sell their products, and they also wanted investment opportunities. And politically, they needed new territory and they needed strategic territory to control during this time, and they also needed to please the public and in a way kind of like please the nationalists that were saying that their country was better. And nationalism then made it to politics, and then that led them to imperialize because there was a lot of nationalism going on. Okay, so now moving on to new imperialism, which was different from old imperialism. Now, old imperialism was centered in South America, and it was centered in a lot of wars, and there was a lot of sickness. But in new imperialism, there was no wars. It was centered in Africa and Asia, and it had new countries involved like Japan and the USA, compared to old imperialism, which only had only had European countries. Now, what led to new imperialism was the medical advancement of the discovery of quinine as a cure to malaria. Now, a lot of people couldn't explore Central Africa, like the inner parts of Africa, because there was a lot of malaria and a lot of like diseases. But once the French were able to find a cure for malaria in the 1800s, this basically opened up the center of Africa to more people, and this allowed for it to no longer be called the white man's grave. Also, a lot of technological advancements, like the development of railways that could get you like from places faster, telegraphs which were able to connect the mainland with the colonies through like communication, and steamships which were able to sail the shallow waters of the African rivers. Also, there was a lot more weapons that could that were made it easier to conquer territory compared to like before when they were like kind of like on the same level as the Africans, so like it became harder. Now they had like guns and stuff that could like actually wipe out the Africans. And another reason why this is not technological, but it's just another reason, is the opening of the Suez Canal. Now the Suez Canal, like I said, was basically allowed to travel between Africa and Europe to be cut by like half or more, and Asia and Europe to be cut in like half or more. And then basically this just made it so that it was easier to colonize that part of the world. And then also in these societies, since they hadn't like been exposed to Western ideas, a lot of them still had widespread slavery. Like there was a lot of slavery going around. And Europeans took this as a moral mission to like civilize them and like be like, oh yeah, you can't have slavery, that's inhumane. And then basically you had also the theory of racial superiority, or like the white man's burden, where they thought that like white people are so much better and so much more civilized than these crazy Africans and Asians. We need to civilize them, and that was something that they used to justify imperialism and what they did in Asia and Africa, like all the atrocities that they committed. They were like, you know what, fine, we're more civilized. We need to like get them. And this basically like drove imperialism through David Livingstone's three C's: commerce, Christianity, and commerce and Christianity, which were like markets and like civilization, commerce, and Christianity. Sorry. Civilization was like making them more civilized. Christianity was introducing them to like God and stuff, and commerce was like new markets and all that stuff that we discussed in the first part. So that was basically the reason why they were imperializing. Alright guys, so now it's time to dive into 1.1c, which is the nature and purposes of the scramble for Africa. So one way that the scramble for Africa came about was due to exploration. Exploration allowed for people to discover more of the African interior, like the Congo River, the Congo Highland, all that area of Africa. And also Africa's extensive river system, which, like we discussed last unit, could be navigable through steam-hauled, shallow water steamships. Britain was also present in many areas of Africa. One of them was the Transvaal. The Transvaal was a Boer republic, which was like Dutch people who went to Africa earlier than the British, but then the British took over them. They were in the Transvaal, they were in Egypt, and they were in East Africa. So imagine just like a snake running down East Africa. That was Britain at the time. It went all the way from the very tip to the very bottom of Africa. Also, France and Portugal had already established outposts in Africa, and this basically was like furthered, I guess you could say, by the time that like the countries were like starting to imperialize by this time. France, which had like little outposts on the coast, started expanding inwards. So for example, they had like little coast in Algeria, little coast in Senegal, and they just like sort of like the main like inside of Africa, like rah. And then Portugal had like a little bit in Angola, a little bit in Mozambique, and rah, rah, you know. And then Belgium, through the Berlin Conference, was able to secure a huge piece of land in the middle of Africa that was super profitable, filled with rubber. And it was called the Congo, which is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And they were controlled by Belgium as well as Rwanda, and Burundi. These were the three countries that were controlled by Belgium, and they're just in the dead center of Africa. Now, you may be wondering, wait, you've named a bunch of countries, but you haven't named Germany or Russia. Now, Russia had no colonies in Africa. They weren't about that. They were way up in the cold. They couldn't control them. But Germany, as we know it as a country, only came about in 1871. Before that, there had been like no cohesive German state. It was a bunch of little German kingdoms that kind of spoke their own version of German. But the actual German, like Germany, came around in 1871. And this led to it entering the scramble later than other nations due to, since, I mean, they weren't around to be there for the beginning, first of all. So, like, how would you be there? You wouldn't be there. And also, Germany was, like, not interested really much. They were a new country. They were like, why would we go into Africa? Like, we need to control ourselves first. But then entrepreneurs in Germany were like, go in for the government. And then they were like, okay, fine, you know what, fine, you win, like, we're going into Africa. And that's why they joined later. That's why they joined, period. But then they joined later because they just weren't a country before that. And the African people, due to Europe going in, they ended up, like, losing a lot of their cultures and losing systems of bartering and trade that had existed for millennia inside of Africa. However, they did become more educated, and they became introduced to like higher standards of health and sanitation, as well as like things like education and infrastructure. Also now were more widespread in Africa compared to like how they were before, and they were more advanced and all that. So it had their good and their bad, but basically it just happened because a bunch of countries just like started expanding like crazy into Africa, like rah 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 rah. So, you know, like that's why the scramble for Africa kind of like blew up in a way. Now, 1.1D is support for overseas expansion in like all these countries, Britain, France, and Germany mainly. So, number one, we have factors encouraging public support for overseas expansion. So, why were we supporting this back home? Like, what was our thought process? So, first is that government policies that instituted things like government education, like state education, like public education. Yes, public education. Think if you go to a public school, think if like they were convincing you to support the American war in Iran, like if they were teaching like, oh yeah, this is what we have to do. This is what's right, and that's what they were doing to these poor little French kids in French schools, and they were telling them like, yes, you know what we're doing in Africa. That's what's up. Like, that's we're the best. And this led to, of course, more nationalism and children being like, you know what? I do like my country going to Africa. Also, the church. The church was a huge player in people's. Oh my god, I can't do it with the glare. Sorry, I'd rather be blind than to deal with that glare. The church was such a big player in people's lives at this time. Like, you don't understand. Like, now people just go to church, but before that, people were like, if the priest said, rub your belly and pat your head, they would do that. Like, they would up and do that. Like, okay, for the Christ, for the Lord. And that's basically one of the things that influence people. Like, the priest would say like, oh, it is our duty as Catholics to take from France and go to Africa and civilize the uncivilized. And they're like, oh, okay, yes it is, we support. Also, in a more like, I guess you could say like a higher end type of society, like the richer people, they thought that like, oh, those Africans are not civilized. We must civilize them. The white man's burden. The theory of racial superiority that I mentioned before, where they were like, oh my god, we feel so bad for them. Like they're so backwards and behind, and we have to oppress them in order to make them better people. Oh god. We don't want to do this. Like, it's not for our gain, it's for them. And people were like, you know what? Yes, I'm being super selfless by supporting this. Also, patriotic pride and nationalism. People not only felt that they love their country, but like, you know how like when you're in love with someone, but then like you start thinking about them just at the most random moments. Like, I'm like, oh yeah, I like this person, and you're just like, everything reminds me of them. I can't look at this Hogwarts bowl because their eyes are blue, and this blue like obsession. Patriotism is just like, oh my god, I'm in love with my country, and then nationalism is like, I can't look at this blue because it reminds me of France. Like, it's obsession with your country, and you're like, okay, calm down, baby. So then, yeah, that's basically what nationalism was, and that's one of the reasons why people were so like eager to, like, people back home were so eager to support, because they're like, oh my god, France, so good. And then also things like literature, art, and like, so imagine you go to see a play, right? Nowadays, go to see a play, and it's all about just like how good the American president is and how good America's doing. That's basically what they were doing. That's basically like what was going on back there. Like, all the plays were about, like, a lot of plays were about imperial expansion and about how good it was and how it was benefiting both the colony and the colonizer. So people were like, you know what, must be true. So just like education, religion, white supremacy, nationalism, and media. Those were the 5 ways that they were controlling you in the 1800s, and that's how they got you to support your country going away and, you know, just like colonizing Africa. Also, some people were not agreeing with this, by the way. Don't think that just because they're European they were agreeing with this. No, that's not true. Don't lump everyone into one big lump. Some people thought it was racist, and they thought that like the theory that we were more civilized than them was just racist. Because like, why are they not civilized? Like, what makes them uncivilized? Maybe just because they don't go through our social standards, and just because they're black doesn't make them uncivilized. But Europeans, like the majority of them, were like, you know what, that just makes them uncivilized. But still, some people were like, no, it's racist. You're treating them worse because they're not white. And that was pretty much what they were doing. They were like, you know what, yeah, you're not uncivilized not because you do the wrong things. It's just because you're the wrong color. And that was their idea. That was what they thought was going on. So I don't know what drove them to think about that. And also they thought Darwin was sufficient evidence to say that, yep, they're inferior because they're black. Whoa. Slow your roll, buddy. Slow it down. That's not what Darwin said. Anyways, some argued also that it was not cost effective. So basically they were like, why are we like funding this when we have so many poor people at home and we're in deficit, and you're over here like maintaining a bunch of colonies overseas? It makes no sense. And it really did make no sense. Also because a lot of these countries like were doing crazy things in these colonies. Like to impose their authority, Germany even committed a genocide against the Herero people in Namibia. And a genocide is the deliberate and systematic destruction of an ethnic, social, or religious group. So basically, the United States labeled the German action against the Herero and Nama peoples a genocide in 1985. So almost a whole 100 years later, they're like, you know what Germany did was kind of effed up, so we gotta declare it a genocide. So like, imagine your country's over here like killing Africans, getting more land, recruiting people to maintain this land, spending money on colonizing this land, and you're like, we have people who can't even eat at home, can't even read. Why are we going out and doing this? It's not cost effective. Like, it's not, the budget is not budgeting, basically. Also, people thought that it would lead to war. So basically, right, Africa, it's not infinite. You know, like, if Africa was this, you had Germany coming in like this, Britain coming in like this, France coming in like this, and then Belgium, Portugal, like, you had all the countries like in this little thing, right? All trying to get more and more power just in this little continent. Sorry for that one. And you were like, oh my god, guys, what is this? Like, this tiny continent, and we're all trying to get it. Like, makes no sense. It's gonna lead to war. Good ideology, but remember, new imperialism, no war. Yes, peace, no war. Also, many working class leaders wanted to like spend the money that they were spending on basically what I just said. Like, why would we spend money on colonizing and committing a genocide in Africa when we could just focus on improving Germany as a country, for example, in that case? Why would we sponsor huge campaigns into Algeria when we have people in France who can't even read or write? Let's invest into making French society better rather than just expanding our territory mindlessly. That was an ideology at the time that people were like convinced people were also following. It wasn't all people just like supporting colonization. Okay, guys, anyways, thank you so much for sticking around. I hope you guys become more educated. Hope this actually helped you guys. And yeah, I hope you guys actually learned from this video. Don't forget